Welcome to the March 4th, 2025 episode of The Energy Show. I'm energy journalist Markham Hislop, and today's show is all about Donald Trump's tariffs being applied to Canada. They went into effect last night at midnight, and 25% on all goods except for energy, which is 10%. And it looks like electricity has been accepted. I guess it's difficult to tariff. That's what one economist told me. Here's what we've got for you. We got a lot of stuff to talk about today, so here's what we're going to do. Quick overview of the Canadian tariffs. I got a little PowerPoint for you. Some polling data showing a large majority of Canadians support Canada's tariff response. And then two interviews with economists. First of all, Dr. Kent Fellows, who's an energy economist at the University of Calgary, and he's going to talk about how the impact of those tariffs, Trump's tariffs, on the Canadian energy system and how it might all play out. And then we're going to talk to Portland-based economist Robert McCullough, who will discuss the impact of 25% tariffs on the rest of the the Canadian American exports to the United States. Man, it looks like a mess. It just is. Economists are looking at this and shaking their head. Nobody understands what the benefit of this is, but you've heard all this before. So let's start off with a video of our Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, as he addressed the media today about the tariffs.
Today, the United States launched a trade war against Canada, their closest partner and ally, their closest friend. At the same time, they're talking about working positively with Russia, appeasing Vladimir Putin, a lying, murderous dictator. Make that make sense. Canadians are reasonable, and we are polite, but we will not back down from a fight. Not when our country and the well-being of everyone in it is at stake.
Now, the first slide I've got to show you is Canadian exports into the States by percentage of that state's total imports. And some of this is kind of surprising. I mean, Montana, 92%, Maine, 70%, obviously a lot of electricity imported. Oklahoma, 50%. Could be energy exports, oil and gas going through down to the U.S. Gulf Coast. California, I would have thought more than 3%. But of course, all of these are explained in part by the fact that a small percentage of a very large economy is bigger than a big percentage of a small economy like Montana. So but this gives you a sense of where Canadian goods are going. We're the third largest trading partner of the United States. Here is the Canadian response to the Trump tariff. So we're going to have a phase one, tariffs on $30 billion in imports from U.S. effective today. And it includes products like orange juice, peanut butter, wine, spirits, beer, coffee, appliances, apparel, footwear, motorcycles, cosmetics, and pulp and paper. So when those products from the U.S. cross into Canada, they will have a 25% tariff applied to them. Now, phase two, after 21 days of public consultation, basically it's a cooling off period to see what happens. But if those tariffs are still on, or if the United States applies retaliatory tariffs to our retaliatory tariffs, which sounds ridiculous, but that in fact is what President Donald Trump said on his Truth Social media platform just earlier today. That as long as we were putting on retaliatory tariffs, he would put on more retaliatory tariffs. I don't know when this is ever going to stop. But this is going to be, phase two will be $125 billion after 21 days. Passenger vehicles, trucks, including EVs, steel and aluminum products, certain fruits and vegetables, aerospace products, beef, pork, dairy, trucks and buses, recreational vehicles and boats. And this comes from the Government of Canada's press release when it announced the package a month ago. Final slide. The percentage of Canadians who support the following Canadian government responses to the U.S. tariffs. This came from an Angus Reid poll that showed up in my inbox today. And 66% of Canadians agree with putting on a 25% tariff on all U.S. exports is a good thing. And Key exports rises to 70%, and an embargo ban on critical Canadian exports to the U.S. 65%. And there are some critical ones. Apparently, Ontario Premier Doug Ford mused about cutting off electricity or reducing electricity exports to the northeast states, including Maine and New England and New York and so on, which would be utterly devastating. They're very dependent on Canadian electricity exports, and then we have the oil and gas. Now, so far, I think actually using oil and gas is a good idea. The Prime Minister has taken it off the table for now, and we'll see how that plays out. But as we've seen in other shows, we've shown you how dependent the Midwest and the Rocky Mountain regions in the United States are on Canadian oil. So now we're going to go to the first interview with Robert McCullough, the economist from Portland. Robert, can you give me a sense of how these tariffs might affect the U.S. economy?
Actually, the tariffs are probably going to injure the U.S. more than Canada or Mexico. The U.S. is the final manufacturer of supply chains. So we're going to be running out of parts for cars, everything from seats to alternators in the near future. In a world of time-on-target inventories, it's not as if we are going to wait 3 months to discover that the car seats are not arriving from Mexico. And Ma and Pa America are not likely to want to go install their own seats. That's going to be a pretty interesting experience. And of course, the integration goes far beyond that. Everything from wood products. Now we're talking about home construction, a very important issue, housing prices, certainly the energy issue, which is my primary concern. But we actually can go all the way down to beer cans. We make beer cans in the U.S. out of Canadian aluminum from Quebec. I think a lot of MAGA supporters are going to be bewildered about why there's a beer can shortage. Well, there isn't really a lot of alternative supply. This is, the U.S. has gradually left the aluminum industry. So without Quebec, we're going to have to start drinking wine. I think that'll be a shock in Iowa.
Well, look, I'm old enough to remember the 1988 Canadian election, which was fought over the issue of the free trade agreement that President Ronald Reagan and Prime Minister Brian Mulroney had negotiated. And one of the criticisms of that time was further integration into between the two economies would lead to vulnerabilities down the road. And that hasn't necessarily been the case. Both sides have benefited, but it sure is the case now.
Absolutely. I mean, we hear supply chain as an excuse for everything. I think my barber said he was having supply chain problems the other day. But the reality is, time on target means that those wheels coming from the supplier to Michigan and Indiana and Illinois, they're not going to be there. I mean, they are just one rail delivery away. So the integration is very scary to U.S. manufacturers. And curiously enough, it's better for Canada to be the intermediary rather than the final market, because there are other markets. There are not a lot of markets for cars without seats.
There's a question for you and maybe you can shed some light on it because you're plugged into the discussion in the United States. I remember very clearly the Biden administration saying, look, we can't be dependent on Chinese supply chains. We need to have our own industries here. We need to reshore industrial manufacturing and, especially around clean energy stuff. And there was a sense that the world was fracturing into blocks. We were going to have the China dominated Asia bloc. We're going to have the EU. We're going to have the North America. And if that is true, then Trump's strategy here of punishing his very supply chains that America depends upon seems like a very curious thing.
Absolutely. I was talking to Tyson Slocum energy analyst and lawyer in D.C. this morning, and I repeated the time-honored maxim, never ascribe to malice what can be explained through stupidity. It is one of the terrible things about the last election is that there are no checks and balances on the man. And so when he thinks up one of these ideas, it goes directly into operation. The tariff, as he's written it, is not operational. And there is some poor customs official this morning sitting at his desk, or maybe he's been fired, trying to figure out how to write this tariff down. This is not easy. And the energy component of it, parts of it are clearly impossible. So there is no question that Trump is down a path that any economist would recommend against. Torturing the Chinese, which of course is an important part of his mission, is the old yellow peril issue. And we've obviously been scared of Asians for many years. Not quite understanding that, but certainly it's 100 years of policy. And but torturing the Canadians, who, when all said and done, are indistinguishable from us, it's a very odd form of intolerance. So
Indeed.
I can't make a game plan out of his activities.
Yeah, I've talked to a number of economists and people in the oil and gas industry, like in the refining industry in the United States. And that one of their big concerns is how the tariff will be applied, because it's such a complex trade between the two countries, and they're so tightly integrated that actually administering the tariff is going to be a challenge, at least in any meaningful sense.
Absolutely. Let's take Cheniere. Cheniere is the largest natural gas exporter in the world, exceedingly efficient, very brilliant people. They receive natural gas from Alberta. That's not surprising. So, but they don't actually keep the natural gas. They sell the natural gas primarily to Europe. The Europeans don't owe the tariff, so his natural gas tariff is apparently mainly designed to injure Cheniere. Now, Cheniere should be his best friend in any normal sense. So, who owes the tariff? Well, clearly the Albertans don't owe the tariff. It's a tax on Americans. The Europeans aren't going to pay the tariff. Those contracts are in place. So we've just removed 10% of Cheniere's net income. That's not good news.
Well, here's a question for you, because we've gone over some of the transcripts of recent earnings calls from American refining companies like Marathon, PFB, and Valero. And the expectation is in the United States that amongst the refiners, that the producers in Canada will pay most of the 10%. The expectation in Canada by amongst the producers is that the refiners will pay the entire 100% of this. Economists that I've talked to think that it'll be a third, a third, a third between refiners, producers, and consumers. And that just goes to illustrate the absolute chaos that surrounds this issue.
I agree. Now, we all carefully listen in Econ 102 to the formula that allocates the incidence of a tax. And I can recite it, but I will take pity on your audience.
Thank you.
But the bottom line is the really big energy components are contract driven. They're not actually buying natural gas shipped across the continent. So yes, we will have components that will affect people in Portland, Oregon, who heat with natural gas. I'm one. But primarily, the big consumers really will not have the flexibility to avoid it. And that's why I'm picking on Cheniere this morning. You know, just a truly excellent firm, but they're staring at their bottom line with terror at the moment.
Let's talk about the auto sector, because Bloomberg had a story this morning, and the estimate is that car prices in the U.S. will rise between $4,000 to $12,000 per car. Now, The average price of an average car in the US is already approaching $50,000. So there's been a lot of concern about the new cars becoming unaffordable for many American consumers, plus the high cost of borrowing to buy those cars, increase the price because of the tariff. And that spells bad news for the domestic auto industry.
Well, and of course, the falling level of consumer confidence. So, for an average person, the interest rate bill is enormous. And of course, I've already joked about driving your car on pillows. Uh, uh, this is not a moment which will go very well in terms of consumer spending. And as we all know, you can always drag your car out for another year or two. And so I suspect that there'll be some very empty showrooms around America.
That
And
certainly makes sense. So that leads to my final question is, could this trade war throw both the Canadian and the American economies into a recession?
absolutely, very harsh on the Mexicans. Mexico has a economy that is more tightly tied right along the border. In terms of Canada, we have any number of products that are going to be affected. Uh, we, of course, don't mine uranium ourselves. We certainly don't make aluminum ourselves. A large amount of manufacturing. Last time I checked, Canada might be the 51st state, but it actually is larger than the U.S. So, so Trump probably doesn't know that we really depend on wood products, and that's where we make houses. So this is going to hit a broad spectrum of markets in the U.S. In a sense, the one that I'm more amused of, electricity, is the least important of the lot because no one knows how to apply a tariff to electricity. Uh, I'm sure your audience knows, but it does move at close to the speed of light. It's not like it stops at the border for the customs agent.
True.
The
We have had the Ontario Premier muse about basically turning off the switch to parts of the Northeast, which would be catastrophic, especially in a cold snap.
Absolutely, and the integration of the electric system on the West Coast
Oh,
is so refined and so productive that interfering with the Columbia Treaty, which we've had in place for over 50 years, on one of the largest hydro systems in the world is preposterous. I have noted to a couple of people at the New York Times yesterday that that came from the flooding and destruction of Oregon's second largest city in 1948. These are not trivial matters. And to add to the mess, he's proposing firing many of the Army Corps of Engineers who actually turn the wheels. These are incredibly smart people. This is training that you do not get out of Cliff Notes.
you can't Google this stuff.
No, you cannot. So, for Portland, our berm between the airport and the river is only about 20 feet tall. So, we may in fact be driving to California for future vacations.
Well, look, I want to leave you with this thought, Robert. On behalf of all Canadians, we're seriously considering drafting the United States as the 11th province. But we would probably put
Glad,
you we probably
I'd
put
be
you on
glad to do it.
probation for a while as the fourth territory before granting you province. Kent, I have a question for you because I'm not sure that I understand this myself. Does a tariff, let's say we have a 10% tariff on oil exports from Canada into the US, and let's assume for a moment that Western Canadian Select, which is the heavy grade from Canada, is at $60 a barrel. Does that mean the tariff is essentially $6?
Yeah, $6, give or take. With economics, a lot of this should be an easy answer. It isn't always an easy answer. So the tariff will be about $6, but that's going to be borne both by producers and consumers. So Canadian producers will take part of the hit, and Midwest refiners, by and large, will take another part of the hit. So it's not really like $60 minus $6 is what we get. It'll be $60 minus part of the $6. And that's determined by really the relative shape of the demand and the supply curves, which are arbitrary or abstract ways of thinking about it, but the way that economists think about it. And so it's really about those two different slopes. So the legislative incidence of a tariff is all on the consumer. So when you think about like who's actually shelling out the dough, that's going to be Midwestern refiners. It's going to be anyone in the U.S. who's buying Canadian oil. But we'll take a slightly lower price as well. So they'll pay the tariff, and we'll end up with a little bit less in terms of revenue.
I had an interesting conversation with a Houston-based economist yesterday who's reports on the U.S. refinery system, and he was saying that it depends how much that $6, how it's divvied up. He said, if refiners have to pay more than 50%, you're going to see a move away from Canadian oil. If it's less than 50%, then the hit to their margins are not high enough to then cause them to reconfigure their refinery and look for other sources of oil. Would you agree with that?
I'm not sure I would put it quite that cut and dry. And also, there's a short run and a long run here. So, I mean, in the short run, they'll be faced to take whatever sort of the market dictates that they take, because retooling those refineries, ramping up production in the U.S., reversing some of those pipelines, that all takes time and effort. And in particular, when I think about the sort of the U.S. consumer, I'm really thinking about that Pad 2 and that Pad 4. So the Midwest area and the Rocky Mountain areas, that's where we're the dominant supplier in terms of import supply. And right now, all the pipelines going into that region come from Canada. The pipelines going out of that region go to the Gulf Coast. And so unless they're reversing pipelines or bringing in barges or doing more crude by rail, they're really constrained in their ability to substitute, at least en masse. Now, will there be some substitution around the edges? Yeah, absolutely. So we'll see some of those quantities change, and that's down to that supply and demand interaction.
I was reading the transcript of the Marathon Petroleum, their last earnings call, and the CEO said very clearly, she said, look, we are prepared. We use a lot of heavy crude and from Canada, and we are prepared to substitute that with light crude from the Bakken, from the Rocky Mountain, maybe even from the Utica and the Marcellus in the Northeast. And she said, we are. Now, other refiners on their earnings calls said, we're not. We're locked in and we don't have that optionality. And so how big a hit might this be for Canadian producers?
I mean, I think it could be pretty serious, but one thing to remember is we're actually in a better position now in terms of the industry than we were, say, 2 or 3 years ago, by and large because of the Trans Mountain expansion. So you think back to 2018, right? We had huge blowouts in that differential. They went to $40. You had producers on this side of the border thinking that they're, shedding free cash flow. This was really a problem, so much so that the government actually stepped in to curtail production. We're in a way better situation now. The differential is, $10 to $15. I think it was right around the $12 mark. And so when you add that $6 on top of that $12, yeah, it hurts. It's not good, but I don't think it puts us in as bad a position as we were in 2018, 2019, at least in the short run. The trick is longer term, if these things are persistent and we think these tariffs are going to be around for a really long time, how much of the American demand retools and what does that mean for Canada? And I think that's definitely an open question and something that theory can only take us so far in terms of speculating. I'm not sure I trust anyone who says they know exactly what's going to happen there.
Yeah, sure, fair enough. One of the things that occurs to me is that the cost basis for the oil sands producers is very different than it was in 2018, 2019. They like many producers around the world, they've been investing in efficiencies and lowering their costs. And Rystad had a very interesting graph that we've shown on previous shows that shows the break even for oil sands producers is on the high end is $65, but really on the low end, there's lots of them around 40. And I understand that even some may be as low as 30. So if WCS stays around 60, does that not give them a little bit more room to maneuver than they would have had, say, if this had been 2018?
Yeah, I think so. They may not like it in terms of loss of profits, but I think they'll keep pumping. And in fact, so those Rystad numbers, that's break even on sort of average cost. So that's at the project level, and that's helps to inform like whether we're going to see new capital investment, we're going to see production expansions. If we look at the marginal cost, which is sort of the part of the cost that economists are more interested in, and that's really about production from existing assets, I would say those numbers are probably between 10 and 50 rather than between 40 and 60 or 70.
Oh, wow.
So for producers who are already producing, I don't think we see major cutbacks in production until we get down to sort of the $40 a barrel range, and even then, only if that's going to be persistent. Now, that's not good for the sector. The sector is not healthy, but it's better for them to keep producing than it is to shut down. They'll take the loss on the capital asset because the capital is fixed and sunk. You can't get your steam plant back anyways, right? If you try to resell that, the scrap value is way less than just continuing to produce from it. So they might not be what a typical person would think of as profitable, but they're going to be bringing in more revenue than the marginal cost, so it makes more sense for them to continue producing.
Yeah, and I think we need to make a point here in that the oil sands are very different. I mean, they are capital intensive at the beginning of the project, and then their operational costs are much, much lower than, say, a shale producer or a conventional producer. And is it the case that most of the projects that we see now in the oil sands have paid off their capital and they actually are operating at what are called half cycle costs?
Yeah, increasingly so. And that actually also has impacts for the royalty calculations, right? And so if you go through the last couple of Alberta budgets, go through the last 10 years of Alberta budgets, provincial government revenue in Alberta from royalties is way more sensitive to price now than it was 10 years ago because as you go into that post payout, as that capital's paid out, they go to a higher royalty rate regime. The idea being that you've been compensated for your capital outlay, you've made all that money back, now it's the public's turn to take a cut. And so the tariff really impacts the public purse to the same degree, to the same magnitude that it's affecting the private purse of these companies as well.
Now we just had an Alberta budget come down, and the finance minister Nate Horner had been warning that depending, where the prices go, that they might last year have run a deficit. It looks like this year, if I understand correctly, that they will run a deficit. Could that get worse?
I think so for sure. The sensitivities in the budget, and they've actually been pretty good on these calculations, pretty transparent, is I believe the current number is somewhere around $700 million per dollar on that WCS range. It'll be around there. Don't quote me on that number, but people can go and look at the budget and check for themselves. That's up from last year. It was about 600 million, and so it keeps getting up higher. So if you take that sort of 10 or that $6 on the tariff and figure we get half or two-thirds of it or something, you can multiply that by the 700 million. It's a pretty big hit to provincial government revenues. So they're going to be really focused on what happens to that WCS price. The formula is a little more complicated than that. The WTI price goes into it too, but really either price drops or if the differential between them increases, we're losing pretty sizable chunks of public revenue in Alberta.
Here's a further complication. I just read this morning from Reuters that OPEC Plus has said that they're going to reverse 2.5 million barrels a day of delayed or postponed production. And now that's not a guarantee. They could change that decision. But if it were to come back into the market, given the uncertainty and turmoil in the United States and in Canada, how might that affect prices and ultimately Canadian producers?
Yeah, OPEC is always I don't want to say it's a wild card because they're actually fairly stable in terms of other producers these days and predictable in their decisions. But the world price does move WTI, it does move WCS. So there is linkages between Brent, WTI, and WCS. Those linkages probably aren't as strong as they used to be, and I think they'll get weaker going forward with the Trump administration being more protectionist, being more sort of economic nationalism. So that's certainly a concern. I think it's a second order concern or a third order concern when we compare it to the tariff relationship between Canada and the US. But it does have implications for Canadian policymakers thinking that we want to be attracting other markets. So the benefits of TMX being that goes to Tidewater, a lot of that crude oil is still going to California. It's still going to the US market. But as we think about other global markets that we could penetrate, OPEC will become a bigger and bigger concern for us domestically.
Final question for you, Kent, because I ask this question all the time, and I'm never really get a good answer. And that is, do we know how competitive Canadian heavy crude would be if it makes it to TMX, or it's on TMX over to put on a ship, which is fairly cheap to get it any place in the world, maybe $2 to $4 a barrel, I understand. And how competitive is Canadian crude?
I think we're more competitive now than we were 6 months ago because of the uncertainty in the US. So, one thing to remember is, I mean, the US exports a lot of its light sweet crude because they're importing heavy crude. So, they import our crude, they have expensive refineries to deal with it. That lets them export their own crude, which is more valuable on the global market. But if you're tooling refineries and you're setting up infrastructure to take supply from a specific trade partner, the US now looks way less reliable than Canada does. So our gamble has always been we have to convince markets that they want to put in heavy oil refineries, they want to actually put in the capital cost to process our oil, and we have to show them that we're stable and we're going to be a lower cost. Well, the cost becomes less important. It's still important, but the cost becomes less important than the stability. And I think Canada really needs to be positioning ourselves as we're a stable trading partner, we're predictable, we don't do wildcat tariffs, and I think that makes us a better gamble. Whether that's actually going to get countries in Asia Pacific to retool is an open question, but I think it's more favorable now than it was pre-Trump.
One more question. And that is, how long will it take for these tariffs to be in before producers, pipeline companies, and other folk, basically the private sector, say, okay, this looks like it's now going to be permanent enough that we're willing to invest tens of billions of dollars in linear infrastructure, which could be a pipeline, could be a port expansion, could be whatever it has to be, because they're not going to do it right away, right? And nobody's going to build a pipeline because Trump put in a tariff today. They're going to wait to see what happens. How long will they wait, do you think?
Um, I don't want to be too doom and gloom. I'm not sure the private sector is going to come back to that table. I think there's some stuff that we have to figure out. We have to do the post-mortem on Trans Mountain. Not post-mortem, it survived. It's not dead. It actually finished. But do that cost auditing to look at the causes of those overruns and do some real heavy lifting and internal look at some of the processes on this, because Canada was uncompetitive for infrastructure investment before this happened, and we don't look like a certain bet right now in terms of the relationship we have with the United States. So I really do think it's going to be incumbent on governments to try to figure out a transportation strategy. That might mean pipelines. It might not mean pipelines. There's lots of other stuff we can do with the economy. I know you're an energy show, but I mean, thinking about interprovincial interties for electricity, there's
Right.
probably other places that we could spend that money more effectively. But I think those have got to be political decisions.
This may surprise you, Ken, but we actually include electricity in energy.
Yes, sorry, yeah.
Yeah. Anyway, thank you very much for this.
My pleasure.
Thanks for watching the show. We are on a mission to reach 10,000 subscribers and over 1 million views. If you're enjoying the content, give us a thumbs up, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to our channel. Thanks for being part of our community.